youth feels that anger, that pain, and they want to go out in the world and they want to smash it or change up the game immediately in a sense. And that energy, that thrust of first learning about things, right? It makes that fire underneath folks. And it's necessary for the older folks, us, not to be like, oh, well, slow down. You don't want to ruin your life. At that same time, us playing as mentors is more of like helping them understand how to navigate. And then training our replacements should be the priority.
It is Freedom Friday and you are still not free.
Welcome to Freedom Friday. It's another Friday and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be free after this hour with Ish and me. We are missing one of our co-hosts today. Sharif Elmek is not able to make it with us today, but we are going to just dive into, since it's Black History Month and we've already kicked off with one Black History Month discussion, we should continue that and keep up with the celebratory month. Ish, how you doing, brother? Well, I'm glad to have you on with this topic, specifically because I knew, like, even not asking you about what you know about Black History Month and what you know about today's topic, I know you know something about it and that you probably have taught something about it. So let me frame it for people listening. I wrote this piece yesterday, I think, or day before yesterday. I put out a piece that said that I'm not participating in Black History Month this year. And that was a provocative title meant to make people read it. But really what the piece says is all due respect to the figures that we study every year during Black History Month. But as a person my age who's aging out and wants to see the young people prosper and want to see that as like the last thing that I see is I want to see young people prospering to the future. I have to start thinking about the future a lot more. So I thought, hey, why don't we repurpose Black History Month to be like Black Futures Month and start talking about who's doing what, like in terms of young people? What's the most promising? Because every movement that we have ever had, Black Power movement, civil rights movement, all of them depended heavily on young people and put young people at the front. And that's because young people, number one, are very effective. Two, they're more creative than a lot of us are, right? They done figured out ways of doing things that that we could take note of. So why don't we lift them up? There were a couple of components to what I wrote. The first one was about statistics. So like, if I made you look at Black statistics right now about our birth rate, about our growth rate, about our education, about our incarceration, about our treatment in courts, the economy, the housing market, if I could just keep going down. If I asked you to look at all the statistics and then I said to you, now predict the trend of where this is going for us, and ask yourself just a couple of questions. The first question is that what I just said, what do you think these statistics point to? Like if you were a betting man, what would you bet on? And then the second question is, do you think it's going to change or get better by itself? Right? Do you think and if the answer to that is, I think the trend is we're going somewhere bad. And the answer to the second question is, I don't think it's going to get better or fix itself. That changes everything for me right there. That changes everything. So let me stop. I'll say this. I started the piece out with Captain Kirk kissing Lieutenant Uhura in 1968. This was an episode of Star Trek where a white man kissed a Black woman on TV, and it was a scandal. It was a big deal. It was such a big deal that the kiss itself has its own Wikipedia page. That's how big a deal this was, that a white man kissed a Black woman on TV. And the funny thing about that, or interesting thing about that, is I can remember in the 1970s when Star Wars was a big thing. Remember thinking as a kid, man, in the future, they don't even envision us in the future, right? Because there was none of us in the movie, really. Eventually there was one person, Billy D. Williams. They got him to do a cameo in one of the movies. But I was like, man, it's a white future. There's no such thing as a Black future. They can't even imagine us. That's the big thing about that kiss in Star Trek. People freaked out, like, in the future, Black people and white people are going to be kissing each other? Oh, hell no, right? So for me, it became really important to think about Black futures and Black futurism, and maybe that's what we should make this month about. Ish, I know you know a lot about this because you just even before the show were giving me some resources about this. What do you think about that framing, about shifting from the Black past to the Black future?
I think it's an interesting framing, especially in the tradition of Carter G. Woodson, of researching all year and trying to uncover the pieces of the past that have been forgotten or distorted or just simply like marginalized and thrown out, for folks to get a deeper understanding about which path that they need to go to. And I think that exploring it through that lens and having your eye on the future switches up kind of the focus and also kind of takes it away from really, quite frankly, what Black History Month has been kind of reduced to, which is just like a procession of illustrious individuals. You know, you ask, I was with a group of students on Thursday at a school providing support around cultural appropriation. And one of the questions I started off with, because the next day was the first day of Black History Month, was who started Black History Month? Who was the person? Not one student, and these are seniors, 17, 18-year-old kids at a school that had mandatory African-American history, could tell me who Carter G. Woodson was. None of them. Never heard of him. Some of them said Martin Luther King. Some of them said some other nonsense. But it just goes to show you that what he even represented was the future. He recognized the importance of having and understanding the past in order to understand and move in the future. And I think that's just a brilliant framing, and it speaks to kind of more of what it represents than what we are kind of shown today through media and Target store folks. Did you see the news article that they had to pull some things off because they misidentified 3 civil rights activists?
No, stop it.
Recently,
stop it.
Yes.
What did Target? What are you doing? But if you want to sponsor the show, anyways, that's interesting. Though to the concept that what you just said actually puts a needle in part of my concept, which is you still do need to know what the past is. So when you ask young people who started Black History Month or who Carter G. Woodson was, there should be some high level of proficiency. So I'm not wanting to throw that away. I'm not wanting to change that. I want you to be proficient in that. I just don't want you to dwell in it without thinking about, okay, what does this mean for my life? And what does this mean moving forward? What does it tell us about the game that is being played against us today? For instance, I'll give you a for instance. If you never heard of COINTELPRO and you don't know what COINTELPRO is, right? For instance, then it would be shocking to you when something happens to you, like Ferguson, where Black activists were showing up dead in trunks of cars, right? It would be shocking to you that it could even be possible that your government could participate in something that was so anti-citizen, right? But if you know about COINTELPRO already, you could be thinking to the future of always looking for signs that could happen again, right? How much do you know about Afro-futurism? This was something I picked up to talk about as like the central piece of my thing that I wrote, because it's where I could locate my idea. I could put my idea and say, well, Afro-futurism has already thought a lot of this through. So what do you know about Afro-futurism?
Well, I know Afro-futurism is kind of not only just intellectual pursuit, right, of folks throughout the African diaspora kind of imagining a Black future and what that would look like, but it's also through art, and it's also through other means of demonstrating kind of like that idea. And even when we look at how Black folks were portrayed, and you just said the example of Star Wars, you would look at like things coming from like the Jetsons. Like there were no Black people in the future in the Jetsons, right?
There wasn't.
And so like this looking at this, and then figuring out, okay, so what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think Afrofuturism is that answer, is that response. And, Black folks were doing Afrofuturism before folks had a name for it, right? It was just imagining, we're not going to be gone in the future. So what does that
Mhm.
future look like?
It's really funny. So I have this little definition here. The term Afro-futurism was coined in the 1990s by Mark Derry in his essay Black to the Future, which looked at speculative fiction in the African American context. Afrofuturism addresses themes and concerns of the African diaspora through a techno, cultural, and futuristic lens, often emphasizing liberation, diaspora, agency, and a dynamic reimagining of Black identity and culture. Right. Like that fits so in with what I was talking about. Now, I do want to say this. I did not know that the term came from an essay in the 1990s. And it apparently, I don't think that this Mark Derry dude who wrote it is is Black. So there's a little bit of issues with that. But I will say, for people listening of a certain age, long before he wrote this piece in the 1990s, there was this thing called Parliament Funkadelic. And Parliament Funkadelic and George Clinton and the crew did some Afro-futuristic culture and music long before it was a thing. And they imagined a whole world. They built a world within their music and their stage shows and everything that had characters and everything. And it was futuristic. It was a spaceship that would land. As a matter of fact, the spaceship that used to land in the 70s on their concert tour on the stage is actually at the National Museum of African American History in DC. It's on the top floor if you want to go see it. But to your point, I mean, we've been imagining a future for a long time. But man, you mentioned the Jetsons. I'm thinking about in my lifetime all the things I grew up watching that had no Black people featured in it at all. And all of the space stuff, Lost in Space, Space Odyssey, Star Trek, all of that had very little idea that there would be Black people in the future. You know what that could turn into? A different concept. I wonder what you think about this. Afro-pessimism, right? And nihilism. Why do we have young people who honestly, in some cases, don't believe that they're going to live into their 20s? They themselves don't think of a future beyond like 21, 26, 27, because for so many of them, Afro-pessimism kicks in. And, just like the rest of the world can't imagine a future for us, maybe, we're teaching our young people to not imagine a future for themselves by not building a world in a thing like Afrofuturism. What do you think? Could this be an antidote to anti-pessimism or
Well, I mean,
Afro-pessimism? I'm sorry.
well, I believe Afro-pessimism as an intellectual pursuit is, it is kind of nihilistic, but at the same time, a useful tool to analyze the current situation
Mm,
and try to make sense of the past, right? Because you are basically saying, like, by default, right, they're going to be killing folks if they protest, like you just brought up at the beginning in Ferguson, right? If you know about COINTELPRO, Afro pessimists are basically saying, yeah, of course that's going to happen. This is how the system is structured. This is how Black folks are treated if they challenge the very structure. I want to give a shout out to my homie, Dr. Devon Johnson at the University of Tampa, who actually just wrote a book called Anti-Blackness and Nihilism, which I haven't got into it yet. But this brother breaks down this kind of connection to that kind of internalization of a negative view of oneself based in an anti-Black society and how that influences concepts of nihilism, of not being worth anything, of your worthiness is just based off the temporary ability to show other people what you have, and rather than a deeper understanding of how it's even connected. And so, like, an Afro pessimist would say, well, that is the whole purpose of having our children do that, is to kind of destroy Black folks. And that has been the default position of this society. And so, like, you can't really necessarily argue with that if you do know the history. But I think what's brilliant about Afrofuturism and folks who are forward thinking, they're like, well, no, that's not going to happen like that. It could look at it in different types of ways, and might produce different type of situations. But we have to imagine, right? We have to freedom dream beyond what we see right in front of us, right? Because could you imagine our enslaved ancestors, right, just like giving up and be like, oh, well, we're just going to be in chains forever, whatever. You know
hmm
what I mean? Like,
hmm
we just got to get used to this now. And I'm sure there were people like that. But it was also people who were like, nah, I refuse to confine myself to this reality. I refuse to accept what I see. I'm going to run away every single opportunity that I have. Not only run away, I'm going to work slow. I'm going to be like, whatever, laugh at your, smile in your face and laugh behind your back. Because like that type of like resilience and that type of resistance is inherent within the Black identity as much as the horrible reality of being confined to a circumstance that's outside of your control in the immediate sense. And the ability to look at beyond that allows folks to imagine something different.
So you need, and I didn't know this, Afro-pessimism is a tool because it's a realist tool. It's a tool about being a realist. Good, bad, or otherwise. Just look at the data. You don't have to have a judgment of it. It just is what it is, right? So know what it is. But then you do need a tool for radically imagining something different. And the word radical is the most important part of that, because to have any imagination that you were going to throw off your chains and that you were going to do something different requires you really to be radically imaginative, because the reality is so grim, right? You almost have to be crazy. What do you mean you're going to throw off these chains? What do you mean you're going to beat the system? What do you mean you're going to be free one day of all of this? There is 13% of you against, 70 something percent of another person. That's like a guy who's 3-1 trying to fight a giant, right? It's a David and Goliath type of thing, right? So because of that, it'd be easy to not be able to imagine, not speculate, not be able to think through what you could do. And then that creates hopelessness and you become hopeless, right? And I don't think anything that we read in the past from any of our people was meant to induce hopelessness, right? None of them even talked about hopelessness, right? Nat Turner didn't talk about hopelessness. Nat Turner was like, well, God told me kill some people. John Brown wasn't about hopelessness. Here's the thing, though. I think that there is a group of Black people, I won't name names, who have succumbed to the reality that it's how bad it is, and that there's only one way to win, and that's to join the other team. Right? You either join or you die. Like, if you want to make it in America, you either become Candace Owens, which is a fast track to actually being successful, right? You become Thomas Sowell, you become, Tim Scott standing on stage talking about, I just love you to Trump. That's one way to win, right? Get in the House. And the way that you get in the House has a lot of code words. So you say a lot of things like, I don't think racism is everything. And then, all of a sudden you got $1 million, right? So that's one way to make it. This is the whole thing going back to the 60s about whether integration was the thing that was going to save us or whether liberation was going to be the thing that would save us. And I think that's because white supremacy gives you one or two choices. Either join or be the enemy. And I think like the radical imagination part, you'd have to be radical to think anything different.
Or no, and that makes me think of that Prez verse, and they're like, you either a rebel or a slave. So I rebel in the belly of a beast. Like, so like when we're thinking of that, I think that is fascinating to even frame it in that way. But at the same time, we also need to remember that during the time of even the conversation of integration, there was nuance of conversations happening, right? Even Martin Luther King, and like speaking to the Georgia Association of Teachers, even said to them, I'm not silly. I don't want to integrate ourselves out of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a recognition that there's a form of integration where you're just not discriminated against in public spaces. You're not treated differently in public spaces, things like that. But it did not extend to this like kumbaya around the fire that, everybody's going to be like mangled within this very structure, because there was a recognition that this very structure needs to change, right? And even younger Martin Luther King believed that he could change that system. By the time he was older, he straight up said, like, there's this, I labored to try to fix this. And now I see the whole thing needs to get done away with, because he recognized that at the end of the day, if we just simply integrate into a burning house, we're integrating ourselves into a very system that is premised off of anti-blackness, premised off of the exploitation of folks, of the extraction of resources that is unsustainable. And in order to actually have something still around for us to even be liberated in, we have to not simply just integrate ourselves into that situation, right? And then even the other idea of liberation, right? There's very much a whole spectrum from complete separation of separating and creating an own state within the United States, right? Speaking about the New Republic of Africa, right? Or the whole idea of liberation is from like going back to the continent and teaming up with the diaspora, right? In order to create a base. But there's even nuances within those arguments and debates. And I think that speaks to the robust intellectual kind of engagement of Africans across the diaspora, or people of African descent across the diaspora, not confining themselves to what others are saying, this is the way to go, right? This is what it means. You need to integrate, or, you know, if you don't integrate, then how do you expect to get a good job or live in a house? Because that's somehow turned into the ultimate goal, unfortunately, of a lot of people. And that logical kind of connection right there that you're making, a Candace Owens, right? I'm sure she lives in a big house right now, drives a nice fancy car, right? She's like, I don't really care what y'all talking about as I'm getting my, you know, my wig custom made or whatever. I don't know if her hair is natural. I don't want to throw shade too much.
It's natural, but she needs some help. She doesn't need it as much anymore. If you look at the early Candace Owens, she needed something help really bad. She was coming from a place of pain when it came to her hair. But now, you know, she's worth, I think, $30 million or something. And you have to ask yourself, like, wow. So she was a college dropout who had nothing going on. She was a total liberal. She ran a website that was a pro-Obama website. And she was anti-Trump everything. And overnight, she put out a video on YouTube saying, I'm coming out as a conservative. And the whole thing was like she acted, you know, and the coming out to your parent that you're a conservative. And that thing got millions of views, right? That first thing got millions of views, that first video, and it was off to the races after that. And today, now she's got 2 shows. She's got a radio show. She's got millions of people following her. She's got a best-selling book, even though she's a college dropout with hair that comes from a place of pain. So, you know, Tim Scott was a normal kind of Democrat type of dude, businessman, whatever. He got recruited to run. And before you know it, his whole talk track changed. That tells you that white supremacy does have job openings for you. So, you know, if it's going to be die or do that, like, what's the alternative? Sitting in your, like, you know, in your crib by yourself, reading Black power books and not having anybody listen to you. Or you could be Candace Owens. You could be on TV. You know, you get millions of dollars.
Wow.
House, a car.
No, and that makes me. Have you seen the Clarence Thomas documentary on PBS?
No.
That, you know, Clarence Thomas was a radical back in the late 60s, early 70s. And even to the point that when he married his wife, his friends were surprised that he married a white woman. Yeah. That's how radical he was. And that's pretty radical.
I got to watch this documentary, because this is the story that I remember with Clarence that's important to this. And somebody close to me was close to him, actually clerked for him or something. He was teased relentlessly by Black people for the way he talked. He was country and he was gula. And more refined Black people gave him a really hard time. And it shows today, right? He's still getting them back. He's still paying them back for, you know, talking about the way he talked and whatever. But in college, he had a situation where he felt like he wasn't being seen as talented as everybody else. And he internalized that to mean affirmative action is bad, even though affirmative action is how his ass got into college, right? So, you know, he had a transformation to anti-Blackness, but it feels like it was always kind of there because he resented Black folks. But again, the big choice is, do you want to radically imagine a different future where you don't have to make a decision of joining or dying? Or do you want to just join? Because one is easier, right? There's this part in the Matrix movie where the dude says, I just want to know what a steak tastes like again, meaning he wants to be put back into the Matrix. Like he got freed from the matrix. He was liberated from the matrix and taken out. And once he saw what it was like in the real world, he was like, put me back in. I'd rather just sleep in the matrix than be awake in this shit, right? Which I think is it's deep. Here, what do you think about this idea? Because I'm stuck on this radically reimagined, because I think we're like, as a people, we're constipated as a people. We got so much shit in us. We don't know what to do, right? We're at a precipice at a time where there are no signs of hope, no new ideas, nothing that's coming up right now that looks like it's going to be our freeing. Just a lot of stuff that feels like problems. Just a lot of stuff that feels like aggression and pain and whatever. So radically imagining, the first person that comes to us with a cultural aesthetic and a new way of seeing the world that looks like fun in some ways, looks like freedom, is going to win, I think. But what about this idea that you mentioned Malcolm, you mentioned Martin, we could mention many others. It feels to me like all of them towards the end of their life had a realization of some sort that got them killed, right? They all had an arc, and towards the end of their lives, they were having some realizations, and they were starting to like realize. I think in Malcolm's case, it was a realization that the humanity of man was very important, and that we can't win separately, that we all need to unify, whatever. That's when he died. Dr. King realized this needs to be a class-based movement. This needs to be about poor people, period, because poor people globally are catching hell. So when you start dividing up poor people to fight each other, that's a way of the ruling class to win. So he imagined a world where poor people united and came together. I think the lesson that you learn from that is don't radically imagine anything.
Yeah. I mean, it's based in this, man, and it's kind of like, you better get back in your place, boy. What do you think this is? And it's like, it's okay if you work in this certain lane. Even King got that critique towards the end of his life. Oh, that's not your lane. You're actually doing harm to your people or to your movement by caring about these things. And I think, James Cone broke it up beautifully. Like Malcolm had to learn that all white people weren't devils, and Martin Luther King had to learn that there's a lot of them. And they both kind of got to that point, right?
They started crossing paths with each other.
And that is fascinating within itself. Du Bois, even towards the end of his life, said, F America, despite years, decades, trying to redefine running for the Senate as an independent candidate, kind of having his passport taken away for years, being confined, you know what I mean? And at the end of the day, he's like, all right, y'all, I'm out. And he moves to Africa and dies in Ghana, right? And see, like this kind of reality, when you look at these folks, right, kind of switches up the game and be like, well, how do we build off of what they already did? How do we imagine where they left off, right? And then I think of a person like Ella Baker, who actually recognized from jump, it's problematic to put our faith in the one person, right? Because if that one person is gone, what happens to the movement? She was very critical of King and how the folks surrounding King elevated the way he did. So she helped energize the youth. And this just takes full circle from the beginning of what we were talking about. She recognized it will come from the youth. The answer will come from them by them practicing in the real world what a world that they want to see actually looks like. And that led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, right? And how that first generated as like a situation where young folks would actually come to a consensus in a multiracial alliance before moving forward. Now, of course, as the Black Power movement gains steam, then you start to have conversations about like, well, should we allow white people to be in SNCC, right? Should like, what should the role be, right? And of course, you throw in COINTELPRO, and that joint kind of just fell apart afterwards. But the idea of it that led it to its first like thrust, where folks moved to the South, lived side by side with sharecroppers, and then like started freedom summers and schools, all that was the youth doing it. These are 20-something-year-olds like leaving their colleges, leaving their towns, and moving down to a place they had no idea what it was like, and then staying there for years and organizing people, voter education, having people registered. that is powerful. And I think white folks, good white folks, are co-conspirators, need to do that now. They need to move to these white areas and go to these churches and these school board meetings and start interacting and having real conversations with them. That would be dope. But that's a whole nother conversation. But like when we're even thinking about how to imagine, I think that's those shoulders of our ancestors that dedicated their lives to the freedom and emancipation, not just of Black people, but of this world. How do we build off of that and then also energize the youth for them to start the process of imagining something different? And that radicalness is radical because it's something else, man. At the end of the day, the system and the structure that we exist in doesn't want that type of smoke at all. And if they see that type of smoke, they're definitely going to go out their way to pat it down, to disrupt it, to kind of use AI algorithms probably nowadays to confuse us about what the situation actually is. And we have to be clear about that. We have to understand what that reality looks like in the present in order to switch it up for the future.
I'm glad that you mentioned AI. You mentioned so much in there that I think is really important. The AI part just catches my attention because right now, the model that AI is trained on is anti-Black. So when you punch in like just, for instance, Midjourney or one of those, you punch in woman, a realistic woman, it'll pop up a white woman. So if you want a Black woman, a brown woman, or any other variety of woman, you have to specify a Black woman, not just a woman. It won't even pull up a diversity of women. It'll just pull up white women first. And it tells you what the model is trained on. That's a small example, but there's lots of like examples of that where if you want it to render Black people, you have to be very specific to make it do that. And that tells you the extent to which we are not baked into the future. People's future plans when they are doing all this great industry stuff and all this kind of plotting out the world. They don't see Black people in it. Something else you said to me that I thought was really interesting, though, is that Ella Baker and all of them had to be radically creative in their thinking. Even when you think about Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance, the idea that a Black woman from Mississippi should get on a bus and go to New York and try and disrupt the Democratic National Convention. You have to be pretty radically imaginative to think that you're going to get on a bus and go from Mississippi in that era too. To do it now, today would be unthinkable, but in that era, to think that you're going to get on a bus as a country Mississippi Black person and go and disrupt. And it was so funny and so interesting that the president of the United States thought that she would be so dangerous to be seen on TV, making the message that she had, giving the message that she had, that he formed a press conference to try and preempt her being on TV. And he said nothing at the press conference. He just kind of made stuff up. The reporters were kind of like, what the hell is this? What are we watching? And it was so that he could keep her off of TV. And all that did was actually make more people want to hear from her. Right. But if she hadn't radically imagined that the possibility that she could disrupt something big like that, that'd be like me today saying, I'm going to disrupt the banking industry. I'm going to go to Davos and disrupt Davos, where the billionaires are, right? I'd have to be radically imaginative to think that I can do it and then to actually do it. And with SNCC, the way that you mentioned SNCC, I think all that youthful energy is where a lot of the creativity of the movement came from, like creative ways of protest, creative ways of direct actions or whatnot. The old people wanted to do some form of direct actions. Young people thought of inventive ways to make it happen. That's probably where we're at right now today. And even I mentioned Ferguson earlier. That was very much a youth thing. And that made worldwide reverberations. Came from the youth. Do you think that maybe old people, and I include myself in old people, they're kind of the problem in some ways. Like old people should be the sages. They should be the teachers. They should be the librarians. They should be the book givers and all that stuff. But some of us are holding on to positions a lot longer than we should be holding on to them. We're not bringing up our replacements. And this is in churches. This is in nonprofits. This is in, they're radically imagining the past. They're radically reimagining the past and replaying it constantly. And maybe that's what would be scary about this shift from giving some of the agency that we hold to young people to lead and to take us forward. Um, there's a young man in Florida. He's the first Gen Z congressman. His name is Maxwell Frost. He's one of the sharpest dudes. Like, you know, I don't know all about all his politics. I just know that he roasts the hell out of you in the congressional hearings and stuff. He'll roast you to death, and you don't even know you're being roasted. I think that's the energy that we need to win. What do you think about this old people thing? This thing about like, what should old people do now?
Well, I put myself in the old people category too
Stop
right
it.
now.
If you
Well,
old, I'm
listen,
Moses. I'm telling you, but go ahead.
but yeah, no, I think that that's very true that, you know, older folks, we need to be very clear about our role and not try to stifle the youth, right? We should be teaching them, we should be going over the lessons that we've learned. But it's kind of like that Cat Stevens father and son song, right? You know, just because, you know, following what I did doesn't necessarily mean, you know, speak to the youth. Like the youth feels that anger, that pain, and they want to go out in the world and they want to smash it or change up the game immediately in a sense. And that energy, that thrust of first learning about things, right? It makes that fire underneath folks, and it's necessary for the older folks, us, not to be like, oh well, you know, slow down. You don't want to ruin your life, you know, because at that same time, us playing as mentors is more of like helping them understand how to navigate. And then training our replacements should be the priority when we're talking about these things and giving them the space and the protection. Really, the protection is so necessary for them in order for them to really do the work and experiment in the real world. And I'm going to quote another Dead Prez song. I don't know why Dead Prez is on my mind right now. Hopefully that new album's dropping soon. But it's practice, theory, practice. Wisdom is organically grown. It's never prepackaged, right? We can't simply just give them all the wisdom and expect this is how you do it. No, we have to give them as much, allow them to practice those theories, develop their own theories from what they practice and when they can have to go back to the drawing board, and then allow them to develop their own wisdom and then from us to learn from them, right? Because Paulo Freire even said education is a two-way street. And I knew as a teacher that if I didn't know that child sitting in the back of my class, if I didn't know what they cared about, what they thought about what we're going over right now, then they're not learning from me because I am not learning from them. And that's the symbiotic relationship that we have to develop amongst youth, amongst our elders, and even amongst our ancestors. We need to be in a consistent, continual kind of conversation with one another and dialogue with one another in order to kind of like speak to what our situation is today and then help produce a situation where we can still continue that conversation into the future.
That's deep. What do you think is the way that we operationalize having young people practice? Like, I love the words you use, practice and experiment. Like, we need to develop space for them. But what's the operationalizing of them actually practicing freedom, like Ferrari said?
Well, providing the space of allowing them to actually go out into the world and fall flat in their face sometimes. The ability not to judge them when they make mistakes, but help them get up and be like, yo, this is the things that, you know, I learned through this process as I did it when I was your age, or how I made sense of the world as I was going through it. And I recognize right now that you live in a different world, that you're exposed to different things. And I love how the youth always makes that very clear to the generation before them. You know, whatever you're talking about, this is different now. And it is, quite frankly. And me and my wife talk about this all the time. She's like, oh, snap, you know, the world ain't ready for this youth energy right now, that anger, that rage, this kind of like monster that these societies or this system has created, right? These young folks ain't going to be playing no games in the future as the resources start to dry up and then repression becomes much more harsh. They're not just going to sit in their houses and be on their phones, regardless of what the ruling powers think it's going to be. And I think that speaks to the fact that there is still hope in that. And that as older folks, as this starts to happen, we need to allow them to be in the positions necessary so they're not, not like throwing their lives away, but at the same time, putting their lives up for a truly bigger, just cause. And we need to be there and help them up when they fall. And unfortunately, I think sometimes old folks are just like, oh no, here, let me mentor you to become part of this system. You need to learn how to code switch so you can, be who you are normally. But in these situations, you need to be different because that's just the way the world is. And there's some truth to that, but there's also some soul suckiness about that to tell our children that's how you should operate in this world.
There's a lot of slave training that still takes place, like lots of slave training. I'm beating you because this is make you tougher for the world. I'm keeping you indoors and outside, or indoors and not letting you go outside because I'm saving you. I'm keeping you alive by doing this. But young people from babies on, and I've got multiple children, so I can tell you, are creative by nature, first of all. So when you start putting limits early on, don't touch that. Don't go there. Don't ask me for nothing. When we get in this store, you need to be acting a certain way. All of those, they start actually adding up and compounding. And I would get pissed off as a person if you was doing that to me. So it's not my parenting style at all. My parenting style is draw on the walls, like, roll around in the grass, do whatever you want to do. I'm not, listen, you're free. You're a free person. And then, adding to that, putting some tools in the room. So my house has books, but it also has a couple of cameras. We got, all the art things you need. So if you wake up on a Saturday and you want, and my daughter does it more than in any of my kids, actually. It is funny though, I got one kid who I came home and all my camera stuff was like set up downstairs or whatnot. Him and a couple of friends had started doing a podcast. I had nothing to do with it. And I didn't push him to do it, but because the tools were there, when he decided he was ready or he wanted to do that, he had what he needed. He could just pull stuff right off the shelf. My daughter is always drawing, cutting, doing something, like making stuff all the time, because we're a maker space, right? Like, and my life wasn't like that coming up. My life wasn't, I was more of the era of, yeah, we're going to give you lots of freedom because it's the 70s, but also there was still a lot of that slave training. Don't go there. Don't touch that. Don't, act this certain way or whatever. And that makes me think even about education, things like Montessori schooling, for instance, right? Imagine if you had one group of people and they all went through Montessori, and then you had another group and they all went through the Cincinnati public schools, right? And you looked 10 years or 20 years later to see what happened to the group that went through the Montessori schooling. And I don't know what you think about Montessori, so it'll be interesting to hear what you think about this. But the Montessori schooling people are the ones that started Google and started all kinds of crazy stuff that exists in the world that didn't exist before, right? A lot of them Silicon Valley people are not only were they Montessori kids, but they are putting their kids through Montessori training. I don't know enough about it to know if it's an option for Black folks, but it does say to me that Montessori has all this like stuff around not being put in age bands, being allowed to do for self, like, and have the space and the resources. What do you think about, first of all, do you know anything about Montessori? Is that anything that you think is a good option for us?
Well, I think it's expensive. And the first
well,
question
freedom is expensive.
Yeah, no, well, the first question I would ask is like, is it the chicken or the egg, right?
Yeah.
Are we talking about folks who will be put in positions to be like that because they come from wealth already? Because even when you talk about the founder of Google or even what's his name, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and they'll be like, oh, well, he started Amazon in his garage. I was like, he had a garage? Shoo. I wish I had a garage going up. And so, it just becomes the reality, right? I always question that.
Oh, that's hilarious. He had a garage, huh? That's funny because it makes me think when I was young, anybody that had upstairs and downstairs was rich to me. Like if you had an upstairs and a downstairs, oh, you got 2 floors? And Lord have mercy, don't have a basement too. If you had a basement and an upstairs and downstairs, I thought you was rich. In Minneapolis public schools, they had a Black Montessori school. It was very popular and they closed it, with budget cuts and all this stuff. Anything that didn't look like the traditional stuff they got rid of. So they closed. We had something called Afrocentric Academy. That was a small learning environment school for folks that wanted an Afrocentric education in Minneapolis public schools, the regular schools. They closed that down, right? Budget cuts. We had a Black Montessori school, and it was always oversubscribed. Like there was more people that wanted to go to that school than actually could even get in. They didn't expand it. They closed it at some point, of course. But I don't know. I'm like stuck on this idea of when you said practice, we got to get people practicing their freedom. Then the educational aspect of that to me needs some attention. Like, how do we put kids like in preschool? What type of preschools are we putting them in? Do they get to be imaginative? Do they get to draw on the walls? Do they get to do all the things that free kids get to do? And then first grade, second grade, kindergarten, what does that look like? What does kindergarten look like for a Black child, in the United States? Is it blocks and colors and building things or whatever? Or is it, again, that behavioral management thing that by third or fourth grade, you have figured out, oh, I'm a slave. I hate you all. Right. Maybe it's not Montessori because you're right. It's expensive. It can be expensive. We can push our regular school districts to do something like that. I mean, you're in Philly. What would happen if you went to your Philly public schools and wanted to start something like that?
They would be like, "Where's the money coming from?"
See, it's always about money.
Listen, not to be an Afro-pessimist, but this society, and that goes directly what you're talking about right there. As soon as things start to work, as soon as models, because these models aren't new, right? We know what works. Smaller class sizes, the ability to move not on grade bands or like in boxes of discipline, but allow like a full range of experiences and access points for multiple ways and different ways of learning, right? We know what works. And anytime we create that model and it becomes successful for Black children, it becomes they shut it down. And I can name examples in the school district of Philadelphia that I saw programming that worked that was cut due to budget cuts, right? And there was no conversation. There was no real debate about why that was getting cut and other things were maintaining, right? And then they default and be like, well, look at these test scores, or then the behavior, right? And then you start to get lost in the weeds that says something is wrong with Black people again. And it's like, no, something's wrong with you. Don't you recognize that every single child is on par with one another, no matter the preschool they went to or the or public or private or anything, up until about third and fourth grade. And then you start to see that divergence happen, right? And there's a reason for that. Folks peep game, but don't know what game is actually happening because we're not preparing them to make sense out of what the reality is, right? And that's why I personally sent a majority of my boys, right, as they were going up to Afrocentric schools at the beginning, because I want them to recognize, like, no, there's nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with this. And that genius, that Black genius, this is inherent, right? And what you're saying with your daughter and your children. It's like Francis Cress Welsing said, you don't put a bird in a cage unless it can fly higher than you. You don't put a bird in a cage unless it can fly higher than you. And unfortunately, our children are put in these cages. And I just want to speak real quick about behavioral management real quick, because I was put in front of an SEL program. I'm not going to say its name, but it was for all the principals. And somehow I ended up in the basement of this building, listening to these folks sell these SEL programs. I'm like, all right, let me look at their board. Let me look who runs it. All white folks, right? And then the whole thing is like, oh, well, it's great for the Juvenile Justice Center and it's great for children to kind of think this way. And they're no longer like exhibiting as much problematic behaviors and everything. I'm like, wow, they're really training our children to accept and then internalize that it's nothing wrong with this. It's wrong with you if you feel that way. And that kind of sucks that energy that we need from the youth to be disgusted, to be unwilling to compromise. Like that is actually healthy at times. And I think sometimes we get into this sense of complacency and be like, oh, well, we can't do that. We can't focus on that. We need to focus on joy, not recognizing that rage is also needed. And that joy is good and everything. But I can tell you right now, Black rage also produces joy. And that full range of emotions has been confined where Black people can't even be like that. That something is wrong. You're an angry Black woman. You too aggressive. You know, and like, yes, I'm aggressive. You should be aggressive too, because something is wrong with this whole situation, and you want me to accept it and become a part of it. That ain't good.
I mean, that rage and what we call self-regulation issues seem to come from somewhere, right? So what's the point of origin? That would be my question. What's the point of origin of that particular behavior? If you're saying, oh, these kids have trouble self-regulating, okay, where's that come from? Let's follow up. Let's get to the root of things, because we could talk about the leaves of the branches all we want, but until we start talking about the roots, we don't know anything. We're just talking, right? So what is the root of that? What's the root of is it called dysregulation? I think is the thing that we will get termed as being angry, fresh. But a lot of that it's pent up. It comes from somewhere. You don't have that level of like outward emotional behavior unless it comes from somewhere, from something. I think it's frustration. I think everything that I said from the time that you were born. Actually, you mentioned Cat Stevens earlier. Cat Stevens has a line in one of his songs. It was, "From the moment that I could talk, I was ordered to listen." Right?
Father and son.
Yeah,
Father and son. Yeah.
That song, I mean, that lyric, that part just has stuck with me so long. The moment that I could speak, you told me to shut up, basically, and listen, is what he's saying, right? And that is frustration inducing. If I do that from you from age one, at the moment you start walking, telling you don't touch that, don't touch the coffee table, blah, 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 whatever. The moment you start talking, telling you shut up and speak when spoken to, or listen to me, or whatever. And you've just learned to speak, right? When you start to learn to think for yourself, you have people saying, now don't go and get no wild ideas. Right? That's literally something we say. Don't go get no crazy ideas. Don't go get no wild ideas, blah, 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 whatever. Just keep doing that to a kid, and eventually by third or fourth or fifth grade or whatnot, you have stolen everything from them as a person, as a young person, as a child. And I can see where you would at that point be like, the natural, I think what you just said, maybe this is what I'm saying, is like a healthy response to that, if you are a free human being, is to resist it and to act out against it. That's healthy. It's unhealthy just to say like, okay, I'm gonna be a slave. Let me just be enslaved to you. The last thing I want to say today about this is, I think that I talked about Afro-futurism and a way of rethinking this month and this history month as a provocative idea about what could we do to leap ahead and get out of our thinking of today. And we need a tool to radically think differently, to think out what people call outside of the box or whatnot. Afrofuturism is a speculative fiction vehicle, but that is actually the way that whole societies have used literature and philosophy and whatever to get to the next level of their humanity, right? That's the way that civilizations work. But I do want to say this. I don't think that we're the only ones with this problem. I think white America has a radical imagination problem too. So, and I think we all do, human beings right now. We are watching wars and genocides take place in different parts of the world without even thinking about studying peace, right? Like our default is war. Our default is militarism, because we can't radically think of a peaceful world. We can't think what it would look like. We can't think about how to interact with countries and resources in any way different than we do right now. So my final message to everybody would be, yes, we as Black people need to free ourselves and free our minds, but so does everybody else. What do you think, man? What's your final word on all this?
Yeah, no, and I just want to co-sign what you just said, and I think it's rooted. And I've wrote about this. Africana studies can save the world. The study of folks who have broke the paradigm, who aren't allowing themselves to be conceptually incarcerated by the current situation, right? We can learn from those folks and then understand that even just like the indigenous and the African worldview within itself is premised off of a respect for life. It's premised off of that. So like, even if wars happen, there's still that sense of like, that's not, we're going to make it right. It's balanced, right? And I think at this point, the Eurocentric worldview, which has everyone conceptually incarcerated, as you described, is confining us to a situation where we think war is inevitable and that we have to build more and more and more weapons, as much that can kill the world 1,000 times over. And that's just common sense. And that common sense is actually what is a reflection of our kind of being lost in that wilderness. And Black folks have been that pillar, especially in America, of saying, okay, you say freedom and justice and equality for all, we're going to hold you to account. And we want to see this applied to everybody. And as soon as Black people start to lose that sense of like being able to break through whatever the current circumstances are, the world is in danger. And when I say the world, I'm talking about folks across the African diaspora, right? And that it's so important to allow our youth at this point in history. Come on, like in the last 500 years, how many times can folks like us get on a microphone and basically speak our minds and not worry about reprisal, even though we might get some reprisal? That's real. And our children coming up now, before the world becomes what we see the writing on the wall for the world is, by knowing about history, we have to prepare them while at the same time giving them the space to really create those maladjusted creativity to really challenge what they're going to experience in the future.
You said so many deep things today. And I think that last part is the wrap up of the show. But I do think the things you said about experimenting, practicing your freedom, like Freire says to us, and my question about operationalizing that will do a lot to free our kids. That'll go a long way. This where you ended right now, so you and I could start a whole nother conversation. So for our listeners, a future conversation I want to have with you is, you just said the Eurocentric view and a lot of things that come from that Eurocentric view. My question would be to put you in the role of anthropologist and say, why? What about that specific group of people? Where did this all come from that they are aggressive in the way that they are aggressive? I mean, listen, if you're going to study Black people and you're going to study all of our attributes and whatever, you study us to death. We're the most studied people ever. Well, then let us study you. Let's just, you've taught us all these skills, these intellectual skills, right? Like, you've given us so much. Well, let us use it to ask you some questions. So if we, in a future show, we should talk about this. Let's question Europe. Let's question the main attributes. Where did it come from? Why y'all like this? What do you, what happened to you in there? I think you would have some answers to that. And so we should come back to that as a future show of what's up with Europe. And dig deep into that. I appreciate you as always, brother. Thank you so much for this conversation. These things like make my day, they make my week, because all of this will be sitting in our minds all week, and I just need a place to have some fellowship with people that can help me get it out. But let's do that next show. Let's do that Europe show. Maybe we could do that because, we need a White History Month. Let's do a White History Month then, right? All right. Well, listen, everybody listen to this. We appreciate you as always. Please share the show with friends and anybody that you think would be interested. We've heard from some teachers that some of you actually listen to this and use it for ideas for things that you do in your class. We appreciate that. So keep doing that. And if you have anything that you would like us to cover, send it to us. The best way I think to reach us is through Facebook. But you can find me at citizenstewart.com. And Ish, how can people find you?
On Instagram at ishx19. All
right, so y'all look for both of us. ishx19. Appreciate you as always. This is another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer now after this hour with Ish and me. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening.